Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Let's start. If you agree with it, if you're okay, can we start? We can. You cannot hear me. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? All right, let's start. Thank you very much for being here. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you to the Euro Dialogues. These days are planned to bring closer to the people different economic reforms. We want to bring these reforms, these economic issues to the general public. And that is why I am welcoming here today in Brussels the 50 young women and men from Spain. These are students from Spain. Some of them are recently graduated, and they will be here for these Euro Dialogue days, today and tomorrow. And we are starting today with very important speakers. I would like to start with these days reflecting on the first panel. We are going to speak about the pension reforms in Spain. You already know that Spain and all the European countries have a rather challenging future. Our population is growing old very quickly, but this isn't compensated by more newborns. We are seeing that we are not growing rapidly enough. We are not reaching these 2.1 children per woman that we would need. But we have something that is rather positive. Life expectancy is longer. We can also say that dependency rates are bigger and bigger, which means that the inactive population is bigger than the active population. So all these factors have an impact on the public expenditure. This situation, the aging of the population, the low birth rate mean that the healthcare system will be impacted, and many other factors will be impacted. Our public debt is very big in Spain. We have 113% of public debt, and the European Union recommends 60% of the GDP. So we have to work really hard because this situation must be reverted. Otherwise, we will have a public debt of 186% of the GDP, which is very much higher than the European Union's recommendations. By 2050, we will have 2 workers that will be paying one pension. One average pension in Spain is 1,200 euros per month, and we would have to collect the money from 2 workers to be able to pay these 1,200 euros of one pension. In the European Union, we have the common euro, so we have a only currency, but our economy is not uniform. We must make sure and ensure that the economy of every member state is stable, so we don't put at risk our currency. And I am sure that you have heard a lot about Next Generation EU, this recovery plan. Member states have committed to reaching different goals in the forms of reforms or different plans, and the Spanish government has drafted a point within this recovery plan which will be reforming pensions. And why are they going to do this? Because the European Commission and the Council have been asking for this reform for many, many years. Our pensions must be sustainable in the long term, and they must be fair. They must be intergenerationally fair. What does this mean? This means that new generations, young people, new workers shouldn't carry all the weight on their shoulders. If we raise the social contributions, this will affect workers and future generations. So the European Commission is asking Spain to reform this within the Next Generation EU plan. These reforms will have a 70% of beneficial rate, which would mean 20% more than other member states. In Spain, we experience a huge gap between wages that have been raised in about 15% since 2008, and the pensions that have risen 45% since. You can already identify the gap. To be able to deepen a bit in this topic, to be able to hear other experiences from other member states, we have here today with us a very interesting and important panel. I would like to give the floor to the first speaker, which is Miguel Ángel García Diez, doctorate in economy. He is a collaborator of the University Rey Juan Carlos from Madrid. He's an investigator as well, a researcher, and he has a very broad experience. He has been a minister for the Junta of Andalucía, from the Community of Andalucía, our region in the south in Spain. And he has a very huge experience when it comes to taxes, fiscality, etc. He will speak about the challenges of this reform. Miguel Ángel, thank you very much. Thank you, Eva. Thank you for your invitation. It is a pleasure to be here with you all to speak about a very important and controversial topic. Before going into the reform that was approved between 2021 and 2023, I'm going to give you the broad picture so you can understand the challenge that we are facing and the decisions that must be taken. The Spanish pension system is a public system, and it has grown, as you can see in the graphic. We have gone from 4.5% of expenditure to 13% since 2007 until 2023. We can see that this means 5% growth in the GDP. How is our pension system? Well, it is a public system that bears all the weight. From 13.5 points, 11.9 plus 2, almost 13 points are from the contributory system, and another one that is passive classes that is going to be extinguished. We are going to pay the passive pensions until 2058. And this we have to take into account. Every decision that is made will affect our future. We also have these non-contributory benefits, and we also have other systems such as the private, but it isn't very well represented in Spain. We don't have it really. It doesn't really exist. With the private system, we wouldn't be able to pay 6 months of the public pension. Let's compare it to or with Europe. We have been speaking a lot about pensions, but we don't always have all the information. So I want to give it to you. Our pension system is very generous. And why? Not because quantities are higher, but because the relationship between the pension received and the last wage received is the highest one in the whole European Union. And you can see it here. It is 30 points higher than the average points in Europe. Our pensions in Spain aren't bad. They are very generous indeed. You can see the picture in the upper side of the slide, and here you can see the benefit ratio. Our benefit ratio is the third highest in the whole European Union. This last table shows that people older than 65 years old has a better treat or receives a nicer treat than the rest of the population. People older than 65 have 6.4 points less than the total population, and 16.1 points less than the population that is younger than 16 years. This means that pensions aren't bad in Spain. Why are our pensions so good or so generous? Well, because we have a system that is created in the following way. The people who are active now will pay the pensions of those who are retired people. Samuelson said this already. We need to find a balance, and this balance is created when the pension system isn't growing more than the GDP. Why? Because the GDP shows a growth in the labor and salaries. Our GDP in the last 20 years has only grown in a 2%, but we have been contributing in a 30.2% for the pensions. This means that we haven't found a balance. We are being paid to a 3.3, but GDP has grown 2%. What does this mean? We are receiving your money, basically, the money of the young people who are working now, who have to assume and accept the debt afterwards. With the average money that we pay, if we accept it and we stabilize it, we won't be able to pay more than 6 months. If we wanted to receive our pension for 21 more years according to our life expectancy, we would need a replacement rate of 60%. This means that we need to find an equity between generations. We cannot live above our means, our capacities, and our abilities. We cannot create that for the future generations. Our public system is very generous, as I already mentioned. And we are updating our quantities in a higher percentage. So we are in deficit, and our deficit right now is 1.6 after having received 1.5 points from this compensation for improper expenses, something that we made up basically. What are improper expenses? What are not these improper expenses? We haven't created the methodology for these transfers. What we did was we injected 1.5 points from the passive classes and the social security to the state through this compensation. This is the situation up to now, and now we are going to see what is going to happen in the future. As Eva mentioned, we face a big challenge ahead of us. Our population is aging. Life expectancy has grown in more than 5 years, and we are hoping it to go farther again to 3.5 years. This isn't that bad, but the problem is that we will have to assume the baby booms generation, people born between the 57 and the 75. This means that from now until 2050, we will have 50% more retired people. We will have 15 million pensioners. And this, we know it, we have proven it, unless we face another pandemic. As I said, we have a big challenge ahead of us. And as Eva said, our birth rate is very low, which means that we need immigration to try and partially cover it. But of course, migration isn't a magic wand. People who come to the country have to be qualified, and the society has to accept these people. As we are seeing and experiencing it in France right now, it isn't that easy. We cannot say, let's bring in 8 million people. No, these people who are coming have to be accompanied by different social policies. To face the challenge that I mentioned, we have 2 reforms, one from 2013 and another one from 2021. The government has repealed the reform dated of 2013. What all reforms since 1985 have tried to do was to slow down the growth of pension spending. Without the reform of 85, 95, 2001, etc., our growth of pension spending would have been bigger. With this reform, we are not going to slow down now. What we are trying right now is to continue with the reposition rate in Europe. and we are going to update the pensions with the CPI. This is a wonderful idea, but it will cost money. Now we will have to analyze how much money it will cost. The government has been saying many confusing things, and they are not very credible. What do they say? They say, oh, this is almost free. We can continue with this replacement rate. We can continue with this CPI plan, and rich people will pay us. So you don't have to worry. Everything will be fine. We can maintain the situation. Other people will be paying for you. These richer people will pay for you. They will give us more money. This is where I start asking myself if this is possible or not. The reform from the government isn't transparent and doesn't give us a lot of information. They have approved a part of this reform through a royal decree, which means that we don't have to present any economic reports. And the last economic reports that we have seen aren't detailed enough. They will reform pensions until 2060. So this reform is very, very important. It has to be transparent. Through the analysis of the small pieces of information that we have, we can identify that the government says that in 2050, the pensions will cost us only 14.8%, meaning that our pension expenditure will grow only 1.3% of the GDP. Since 2018, the GDP growth of pensions has been 1.8%. Since 2018. So they are telling us that from now until 2050, it will only grow 1.3. How can they calculate this? Well, they aren't very credible. They have done maths that aren't just. They have used as numerator voluntary pensions, meaning that people will go into retirement 3 years later than they should. With this, we can save 1.5% of the GDP. But they didn't even calculate everything well. Even if we retire 3 years later, we can only see a 0.9 of GDP, not a 1.5. Half of the population will retire between the age of 66 and 69. The growth of the GDP will be out of range. What IREF is saying is that if we apply different reforms, we will be able to grow 1.6. But the government has used a growth of 2%. The difference between growing in a 1.3 or in a 2% is 50% more by 2050. I hope that we reach it, but I don't really believe it. If you see the graphic on the right side, you can see that IREF says that we will go from 13.5 pension spending to a 16.2 spending. Why? Because they are already applying the 30% of people going into retirement 3 years later. FEDEA has calculated everything with other tools, and we can see this on the right side. The pension spending won't be lower than 16.5, which means that we will spend 3.5% of the GDP. And I will be as fast as possible because I have to finish. They also had to find new revenue measures. So they did the transfer that I mentioned, and they also raised quotas to find a 0.9 growth of the GDP. What does this mean? That social contributions will be higher, but people paying higher contributions aren't going to receive a higher pension, which will give us an intergenerational gap. They've come to Brussels, they've told people from the DG economy all of this, and people from the DG haven't believed this reform that much. Why? Because they are not transparent enough. So the Commission has required them to apply new tools. The government has decided the following: if we don't reach a social dialogue agreement, the contribution will grow every year until we close the gap. In 2025, we will see bigger quotas, we will see bigger contributions, and we will see this guarantee clause applied. Many researchers have concluded that every point of the GDP will destroy 100,000 working or jobs. This isn't the most optimistic foreseen for our country, because we have a huge unemployment rate. Let me get to the conclusions. The system will become less contributive because we are paying less. Equity between generations will be damaged. Future generations will increase the burden on younger cohorts, which are shrinking fraction of the population. Also, employment due to increased labor cost will lower. They also have given us new hopes and expectations that are not real. They increased the lobbying power of retired people by sending the message that any amount of money can be paid, and this isn't real. We have to find solutions. Our pension system is a good one, but we have to make the right decisions. Our pension system is not collapsed, but we have to act as soon as possible, and we all need to act to find an agreement to reinforce our public pension system and to reinforce your bank accounts in the future, really. Thank you very much, Miguel Angel. It is rather frightening all that you are telling us. Future generations should be scared, maybe. But it is important to hear all you have to say, because we have to speak to young people as adults so they can take the right decisions. Also, I wanted to say hello to everybody who is following us from the on live streaming services. I want to give the floor to Marcus. Marcus and I, we always speak in German between us, but I'm going to welcome you in English.
Going to talk to us about the different challenges, demographic challenges we have, and how this also has an impact in general about on the pension systems. Thank you, Marcus.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation and for the introduction. Maybe I can have the remote, actually. Thank you. It's great to be here. First, I have to start with a disclaimer, as usual in this context. So what I'm going to present is my personal opinion, not the one of the Austrian National Bank, which is my employer. But having said that, I just want to give you a short outline of the topics I want to cover here in my presentation. Part of them actually will maybe somehow overlap with what we heard before. Maybe some of will also kind of overlap with the next speaker, but I think that's good to this topic to have it from different perspectives. So we'll first talk briefly about this, the demographic challenge, then I talked about the reform options, and then in the third part, I think that's maybe the most fundamental part, where I just want to discuss some of the goals and the main issues and concerns and trade-offs that's very often also in the public discussion when we talk about pensions. So starting with the first issue, the demographic challenge. This was, of course, already mentioned before, but that's clear because there cannot be a discussion about pension system if you are not talking about the demography. This is the main challenge, so to say, to the systems. And this is, as has already been said, it's a two-folded challenge that has to do, on the one side, with the decrease in mortality, which is the increase in life expectancy. And on the other hand, we have the fluctuations in cohort sizes, in fertility rates. So there's the baby boom and bust cycles. And in the recent decades, it was basically a decline in fertility rates. And then, as also mentioned before, of course, this could be partly mitigated or counteracted by immigration. But immigration has itself, of course, challenges and difficult issues involved. So this means all of those trends will lead to a shrinkage of the working population. We see that to a general aging of the society, and this puts a big challenge to all pension system, as we heard before. So I just have some graphs here just to remind you how this looks like. So that's the biggest issue. That's the increase in life expectancy, which of course is a good trend. It's good that medical advances kind of have led to this almost perfectly linear trend. I mean, this is really astonishing in a way. There are not many laws, so to say, in social sciences, but here we have in almost all countries we have this perfectly linear trend that is now going on for almost 100 years. I mean, only in the end you can see this little drop here due to COVID, but I'm pretty sure it will continue to grow in the future. I mean, and now of course you can talk a lot about the differences between country, like that Spain is almost always at the top of the league, so to say, and then you have the US in recent years, which has seen some flattening here. So that's by itself a very interesting topic, but I won't talk about that here. This is just to show you this linear trend increasing in life expectancy, which is basically 2 to 3 months each calendar year. So we're getting older by about 2 years each decade, which is tremendous, but it's also a tremendous challenge. And the second point here is the decrease in fertility rates. Again, that's almost a general trend. Also here, Spain is in a way very much on the forefront, but in this respect on the other side. So it's clearly below the reproduction rate, which is about 2, a little bit higher than 2. So that's the second point we have to be aware of. And this, of course, both of them together have big fiscal implications, which we've heard for Spain before. The increase in dependency ratios, the the forecasted increase in pension expenditures. And this comes on top, one has to say, on top of other expenditure, mostly of them, or many of them also related to aging, which will be a problem maybe or effect in the next decades. So having to do with healthcare and with long-term care. So that's the picture. Plus, and that's the last point here, in a situation where public debt in many countries, in Spain, but in almost all European countries, is already at a very high level. So there's not much leeway actually to, let's say, cover it in public debt. So that's the picture in a way. So, and it's a little bit a dismal picture, maybe a depressing picture, especially for young people. But then the good news on the other side is that this is basically a problem that is, in theory or in principle, not so difficult to solve. So in my view, it's an easier problem than, for example, climate change, which involves much deeper issues and more complicated. Here, what you need is simply a good design, open public discussion, and political will. So maybe all of those three are in short supply, but in principle, I mean, it could be solved. So what are the options here? And there are two ways to approach a reform of the pension system. So the first path, it's more like the conventional path. This is simply, you wait until the problem is so big that you cannot ignore it. And then you very hastily, often, you're tinkering around with the parameters. You increase contribution rate and you decrease a little bit the benefit. Often it's done in a hidden way. So you, for example, change the adjustment of pension benefits, or you change the calculation of the formulas and all of that. And mostly this is really done in a not systematic, not very well thought manner. And this has been true for many countries over the recent decades, basically. This parametric discretionary reforms. But then there's, in recent years, maybe a decade or so, there's been more a trend, you might call it a fashion, but it's really interesting trend to favor more systematic reforms. And systematic means in this way that you're not kicking down the can down the road until the sound of the can is getting too loud and you have to do something, but you really try to discuss a basic mechanism that might react automatically if certain parameters of the economy or the demography are changing. And this, of course, has to be done well in advance, but you can do it in a more broad-based manner, better thought through maybe, with better implications. And so in a way, it's like a cybernetic system. So you have some changes there, and then you predetermine how the system should react to those changes. And the advantage, of course, is that in this way you set a default path of the system. So this is in the best way, a consensual default path. And of course, I mean, we're living in democracy, so I mean, if a parliamentary majority want to deviate from the default path, this is still possible. But at least it gives some reference point, and you have to justify if you deviate, so to say, from a predetermined, pre-discussed path. So what are those kind of systemic reforms? And they're basically here, there are also two ways. The first one I mentioned here is the notional defined contribution system. That's basically an invention, you can almost say, of the Swedes. So very often Sweden is a kind of a pioneer in certain economic measures. And also there, they designed it in the 1990s after big problems in the pension system. And the main logic here is that the pension benefits react automatically if you have changes in life expectancy. I mean, I cannot describe it here in full. It's a big, complicated system in a way. But the main point is the notional defined contribution system is still a pay-as-you-go system. So it's not a capital market-based system. So pensions are paid by the contributions of the workers, but the calculation uses the fiction, so to say, of an account. So you're paying your contribution in the system, and at the point of retirement, you have this sum of contribution, and this is transformed into an annual or monthly pension payment taking into account remaining life expectancy at the moment of retirement. So let's say you paid something like 500,000 in contribution over your lifetime, and if life expectancy is 20 years at the point of retirement, then your annual pension would be 500,000 divided by 20, so that's 25,000 a year. So that would be your annual pension. But then if the remaining life expectancy increases to 25 years, then you have to divide this 500,000 by 25, and this reduces automatically the pension entitlement to 20,000. So that's the main logic. Of course, there are much more bells and whistles involved, but that's the main part of this notional defined contribution system. And it's like, I mean, if it's designed in the right way, it's running in a way on autopilot. So this is this system that was now then over the recent year copied or adapted by a number of countries, but most of them actually they only plan to do it in the future and they don't adapt it fully. So it's really in place, as far as I know. It's only in place in Sweden up to now. Norway also had something like that, but it's not completely done. What a number of other countries have or have planned to do is to have singular adjustment mechanism, additional automatic adjustment mechanism. Germany, for example, has a sustainability factor, as they call it, that doesn't react to life expectancy, but it reacts to differences in the number of pensioners and the number of workers. So if there's an imbalance, then the system is adjusted. What Finland did is they took one part of the Swedish system, namely the life expectancy factor, and they plan also to adjust the pension benefit to the changes in life expectancy. Then I also added here some factors that, as far as I know, in Spain they were introduced, but now abolished over there recently, which will also be kind of automatic factors. So, in principle, that's a good idea, but of course there are a number of challenges to design a good system with automatic adjustment mechanism, and that has to do with those mechanisms have to take into account a variety of different principles, goals, and the trade-off between them, and they have to discuss in an open way. So there's no magic system, there's no blueprint that is good for all countries. This has to be it has to do with national preferences and all that, because sometimes you cannot square those different goals like sustainability, adequacy, the system should be fair, and all of that. But you can, in a way, try to account for that in the design of the system. Like I just mentioned here, a couple of trade-offs that could appear in the design of such a system. For example, the first one here is the trade-off between sustainability and adequacy. So in a way, it's pretty simple. You could say, I mean, we simply reduce benefits in order to increase sustainability of the system, and this is basically what the German system now is discussing and running into it. That the sustainability factor that I mentioned before works that harshly in a way that the forecast of the pensions now is that in 20 years about half of the retired population will be around the poverty line. So this is also maybe not an optimal system. This should at least be taken into account. The second point is you should find a balance between redistribution and the incentives of the system. So we heard that before. The less contributive a system is, so the more like you have fixed pensions or minimum pensions that are true for all, the more people see that as a tax. So the contribution rate is a tax, and this is negative incentive for labor supply. While if you have a proportional system, as the typical Bismarckian system is, this has less of a tax character. So it's more like a forced saving and has less bad incentives. The third element here, which is maybe also something you should take into account, is the trade-off between flexibility and prevention of poverty. So in the Swedish system mentioned before, in principle, it could be completely flexible. So if a person says that he or she wants to retire at the age of 50, that's in principle possible. But then the benefit is very low, because then remaining life expectancy would be something like 30 or 35. So the example before, the annual pension benefit would be only 15,000. And then, of course, if you have on top of that something like a minimum pension, this runs into the risk that people might either misunderstood the logic, so they go as early in pension as possible, and then they complain afterward that the pension is so low, and then you have social assistance on top of that. So this increases the problem of, or possible problem of moral hazard. Now, last, so I don't know how much time do I have. Should I come to a conclusion?
Yeah, you come maybe to the end because we are running out of time.
Yeah. Okay, so these points are also very interesting and important, but maybe I just mentioned the last thing, yeah, that such a system should have a broad political support. And one of those elements is that the insured population should perceive it as being fair. And fair, I mean, it was mentioned before a couple of times, it's a very difficult concept. And I could just urge you, dive into this literature. Many people just use the term fairness. I sort of think fair is something like a self-serving thing. Fair is a system that benefits myself, but there are much better definitions of what is meant by intergenerational, intragenerational fairness. And one element, for example, that's really important if you think about this automatic adjustment mechanism is actually, and that's here on the last slide, that's the difference of life expectancy between low and high incomes. And this shouldn't be neglected. So what I'm showing here, that's data from the US, that's the life expectancy ranked according to the percentile of lifetime income. And you have in the United States a difference of 13 years between the first percentile and the highest percentile in life expectancy. And now, of course, if you use one life expectancy factor based on the average, this benefits the long-lived, the richer, and harms in a way the poorer, with lower life expectancy. And this, of course, is a difficult issue, which would justify also to have some progressivity in the pension formulas. So maybe I just leave it here as food for thought, food for this discussion. This is just one element of a very complex but very interesting topic.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Markus, for this very interesting presentation and for the insights. Indeed, also we understand this is your personal view, but we, of course, are very much thankful for your insight into your work as a researcher at the National Bank of Austria. And now I go to our third speaker in the round, who is Michael Baslund, who is the research director at the Research Institute for Work and Society in the University of Leuven, Lovaina. Just also to remind quizás en español, que tenéis
just to remind you that you have an interpretation service that you can use, because Michael is going to speak in English.
Invitation, and I'm very pleased to be here. I think we have very little time left, so I will deviate a tiny bit from my script I have on my slides, also because I'm still a tiny bit in shock when Mr. Knell told me it was an easy problem to solve, but then during your presentation you kind of backed down because it's very complicated to get right. And then in the end you kind of said, and you need broad political support. So I said, oh good, I'm back in business studying these things. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. If I may also comment on the last thing on the differences in life expectancy across socio-economic groups, so across educational lines. I of course completely agree with what you say. It's a very important topic, and I think the graph you showed were from the US, but things are looking more or less the same in almost all European countries. I think in Spain maybe slightly less, but I can't remember exactly. There's one thing to note here, though, is that while the average life expectancy does deviate a lot from highly educated people to, say, people with low educated attainment, there is a big gap on average. But if you look at the distribution of people, then you have many people with low education who has high life expectancy, who live for a long time. And you also have quite a big number of people with high education who actually do not live so long. So the means are different, no? But if you think about the distribution, about all the outcomes of these two groups, they overlap a lot. So that makes it very difficult to have a pension system where you say your you are highly educated, you can retire later. You can, of course, make this, but it's not necessarily, it's only marginally fairer than the equal system because the distributions are so different in many countries, at least. I researched this a bit, so I know so I know a tiny bit about that. So I just wanted to say that. Doesn't deviate from your points, of course, but I just wanted to give that. I will only show a couple of slides. The first slide was kind of a backup slide just to say I'm not an expert in all European pension system, and I was about to say that you cannot be, but then I actually thought I saw that you were speaking before me, and you know actually quite a lot of details of many pension systems. But I just wanted to put that out there. Also to say there might be similar challenges, and pension systems are similar, but when you dive into it, and we also heard this from Markus, if I may, presentation, that it's really down to the details in the individual countries. How do you define how do you put minimum pensions? Who get access to minimum pensions? What are the way you kind of earn rights to pensions? Is that from the whole career? Is that from the last 10 years? There's so many different aspects that it's very, very difficult to kind of compare two systems. But you can, of course, draw big lines and draw lessons from other systems for sure. So I don't disagree with you on this. So I want to make, I only have a few slides then because we are running. I want to make a few other points which other panelists might disagree with. And the first one is you can really only eat today's cake. So you can eat what you produce today. You can also eat part of what other countries produce if you have been running, if you have been saving, running trade balance surpluses for a long time, saving up, you can use some of that to finance your pension. You can also use a bit of yesterday's cake if there were big investments done yesterday, but that's kind of water under the bridge because we know in Europe, in many European countries, the last 10, 15 years has not been massive investment years. So there is not much left of yesterday's cake. So it's really what we produce now which can be consumed. And the pension system design is really about how much of this cake that we produce today, or when you go on pension, when there are fewer people working, how much of this cake is going to pensioners? That's one thing. And how is that distributed among pensioners? And that's what the pension system really designs here. And I think that's important because when there are fewer people working relative to pensioners, which there will be when you retire, there are trade-offs to be made. I mean, there are no fixes which will not involve you getting less than you would have gotten had there not been so many pensioners, because there's only this production. Then you say, but we can make the cake bigger, and we can by working more as a society, not you personally, but as a society, and maybe you also personally. That means working longer. That means go faster through the education system. That means bringing marginalized people into the labor market. And now you're thinking, nah, that doesn't sound so good. There must be other ways, but there isn't really. Two previous speakers spoke about immigration. I'm sorry to say, this is tinkering on the margin. No, immigration, if you can spot the world's Elon Musks or similar, that's good, bring them in. But this is a marginal issue, no? Most immigration into Europe, whether from Eastern Europe or from outside Europe, brings some positive benefit, but it's marginal. So you have to bring in many, many people. They often adjust quite quickly to fertility levels. So it's not like you bring in a generation and their kids will then pay for your kids. It's not how it works. It's very, very difficult. And it's a marginal issue. It's fine to do it, but it's not going to change the big picture. But then you think, well, but I mean, of course, now with all the chat GPT and things, productivity will increase a lot. And it may. automatization and all these things might increase a lot. So the cake will grow bigger. And that's true, of course, if that materializes. But there's still the trade-off how much pensioners should have of this cake. And it's not so, I mean, you can say if the cakes grow bigger, we can just give them what we intended to give them. But that means that their living standard, while not deteriorate compared to what they would have got, it will deteriorate a lot compared to what those people who get the bigger cake gets. So there's still this trade-off. You have to decide how much cake they will get, even if it grows fast. One thing is, if it grows fast, it's much easier to reform, of course. If your wage is growing with 5% in real terms per year, you're not so unhappy if the government say, give me 1% to do this and that. So that's the only thing that is to say. I don't want to go through this system because Markus has done it a lot better than I have on my slides. I'm from Denmark, so I just, and if you look at these pensions rankings, you always see the Danish system coming up on top. The Danish system is very different from the Spanish system because that was basically moved away from a pay-as-you-go, as Markus explained before. So instead of pay-as-you-go, where current people on the labor market pay for those who are in pensions, some 20, 25 years ago, Denmark started to switch so that you would rely on personal savings to a large extent. There's still some public pension for sure. It's still a sizable amount actually. But there is a lot, and most people now have fairly high private pensions savings. So the question is, could Spain do this? But then you have to realize that 25 years ago was a very different situation that we was in today. And I'm not saying that Denmark was planning ahead. Denmark actually did these reforms because of enormous economic crisis. But then there's been basically 25 years of reasonably good economic growth before the demographic challenge starts to bite. No, I mean there has been downturns, of course, but up until the financial crisis, the Danish economy had grown for more than 20 years, more or less unimpeded. And in that situation, it's much easier to say to people, wait, we take a bit of your wage growth every year. You were supposed to get 2%, but you only get 1.7. And every year we put these 0.3 into some fund that invests in assets which you can then use when you become a pensioner. So this is not doable on a broad scale, and it's not doable now. I think that was actually sorry, that was a bit abrupt, but yeah, I didn't have much time, so I wanted to put this. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Mikkel. Maybe we can discuss now in the Q&A session if that's doable or not doable to have some kind of capitalization in terms of funds. I'll switch back to Spanish now, so maybe you are going to need the interpretation again. Así que muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much to the three speakers for these very interesting interventions. I hope that all of you here in the audience and those who are following us through the streaming, I hope that you are not all frightened. But we have a bit of time now to have a Q&A. You can ask now whatever doubts you have. Does anybody have a question or a comment? Please, go ahead. You have to put the mic on. Yes, thank you. Hi, thank you. Can you hear me well? Yes, all right then. I wanted to thank you, Eva, for bringing us here. It is always a pleasure to share with you. We shared a meeting with you in Madrid, and it is a real honor to be here in Brussels. I wanted to have a question or ask you a question related to migration. Again, thank you for your speeches. How can we make sure that the birth rate gap is covered through migration? Can it be covered? Can we have any measures? What kind of tools or instruments could we have to kind of try and reduce the gap? Because we have rather negative perspectives to 2050. There's a lot of informal economy. We have domestic economy as well. There are a lot of developed countries that are sending goods to or money to countries in development. Yes, please, can you keep your questions short? Thank you very much. Another question. Hi, I am Miguel. I wanted to ask a question to Professor Garcia Diaz. He said that our pension system isn't in collapse right now, but how long can we keep it going after the reform? We have seen no intent in the last 40 years to modify it in a bigger way. Another question over there, please. Thank you. The last one. Can you hear me well? Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for bringing us here, for the opportunity. I wanted to ask something to Marcos. Regarding this cake, how can we get the cake bigger? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Let's give the floor to the speakers. There was a question regarding migration, which has already been answered. It will not be possible to reverse this birth rate gap through migration. But do you want to add anything, dear speakers? Mikel, can you?
I think my message was quite clear. Maybe someone in the panel wants
Someone
to
more
modify
optimistic.
it. Yeah,
Good.
yeah.
Miguel Ángel.
Birth rate cannot be compensated. There is an imbalance in our society, but we absolutely need migration. Migration is also a challenge. So to give you an idea, to be able to keep the active population of Spain right now, we will need from now to 2050 to have 10 million of migrants to our active population. I think that we have 8% of Spanish people that have been born outside of Spain, but we need, as I said, 10 million of newcomers, new active population. Women can only be fertile during a short period of time, so we cannot increment our birth rate farther than 2%. The most optimistic projections come from IREF, and they give us a 1.55%. So again, to have the same amount of active population right now that we have right now in 2050, we will need 10 million of migrants, immigrants. And this, we have to say it. We have to say it because there are a lot of people that will say, oh, immigrants give us problems, they don't bring any richness. No, this isn't true. But we have to be very organized, and we have to accompany everything with policies that will ensure their integration. Marcos?
Concerning the cake, although I think the cake metaphor was by you, but still I say some few words on that. Basically, I completely agree. I mean, of course, it makes things easier if you have a larger cake, then this redistribution is simpler. But basically, what a pay-as-you-go system does is always there's a question about how to divide the cake between pensioners and workers. And the most important measures are relative measures. It's the replacement rate, it's the benefit ratio, so it's the relation of the pension to the salary. So in this respect, it doesn't matter so much how the cake is. There's still the discussion, there's the trade-off between which part goes to the pensioner population, which part goes to the worker population. And I'm sorry to say, I mean, there is no way around those big trade-offs that are involved in the discussion.
Miguel, you wanted to add something?
No, I just wanted to clarify that my remarks on migration is not a normative statement on migration. I mean migration in terms of will that make the pension system much more sustainable, and that I will maintain that it will not, only at the margin. But of course, it's not a normative statement about migration. I just want to make that clear.
Excellent. Y teníamos una...
Yes, and we had another question from Miguel that was directed to Miguel regarding this bankruptcy or the collapse of the pension system. If we continue as we are, how can we continue? We continue increasing the debt, right? Yes, Miguel. Thank you, Eva. We have reformed our public pension systems many times, and without the reforms we would have problems. In 1985, we would calculate pensions based on the 2 last active years. So people would increase contribution, the contribution to receive more. And throughout the reforms, we would increase the base year to calculate pension. We have experienced reforms. But I am worried because right now we should have continue with the reforms, and right now we have a breakage. We said, let's see what happens, and then let's see how we pay it. The system will break down. Probably. We don't know, but maybe we will face problems similar to what Greece experienced. We have a high probability of seeing these pensions being reduced because we don't have more time. Reforms must be progressive. The efforts have to be balanced, but this requires time. And in 2023, the baby boom generation is already going into retirement, so we cannot calculate anything from now to 10 years. The structural deficit of Spain is around 2.3%. The 90% of it comes from the pension system. We have to take decisions. We have to take them quickly, but they will not be able to be as progressive as they used to be because we don't have more time. Are we going into collapse? Are we going into bankruptcy? When I speak about collapse, I speak about a system disappearing. It will not disappear, but we cannot continue with the prospects of these reforms because it is not sustainable. It isn't economically sustainable. We are not respecting the component number 30 of the Next Generation's EU. With this guarantee clause, we will not be able to close the difference. And next year, whoever is in government will have to take decisions that will not be as welcomed by everybody as the ones that we've seen in the last years.
Gracias a los tres ponentes, ha sido muy interesantes.
Thank you very much to the 3 speakers. They have been very interesting. Well, I guess that we are all a bit worried, but we are better worried and informed than not informed, right? We will have to find solutions from the political side, and you, as the future of Europe, will have to find solutions as well. There are many solutions that are there, and we will have to take difficult decisions. Maybe we will have to take decisions when it comes to the contributions. We will have to compare our system with other countries that take into account life expectancy. rates. And in conclusion, with this panel, we've received a lot of information from Spain and the rest of the countries. Let's go into a recess, let's have a coffee break, and then we will come back to continue with our debate. We will speak about the Spanish labor market and how it can be reformed based on other member states. Thank you.
Vale, perfecto. Pues si os parece, empezamos con nuestro segundo panel, que va a ser muy interesante y muy dinámico, os lo prometo, que es un tema muy importante, además.
Well, let's start with our second panel. That will be a very dynamic one. We have a lot of young people in the room, so we are going to speak about employment and the reform of our labor market. This reform is very important, and we constantly talk about it because we have been speaking about competitiveness, European market against China, United States. We have been speaking about the lack of productivity, all this reduced productivity that we have in Europe. We in Spain had the real estate start working. Simply they cannot access the labor market. We have just heard during the previous panel that the aging of our population will give us a lower productivity and lower contributions that will not be able to cover the pensions. And that is why I'm really happy to have with me a very important panel today. I have with me Marcel Jansen, professor from the Autonomous University of Madrid. He is a researcher for FEDEA, and he has been a consultant of the OECD, for the Development Bank, and many other organizations. Marcel is going to talk about the challenges of the Spanish labor market. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eva. Thank you for welcoming me. I said to the people in Spain, well, bye-bye, I'm going to Brussels. And they said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to speak to Spanish students. Again. Okay, I am going to divide my presentation in 2 parts, okay? Let's see where we are and what the challenges are. After the European funds, we had 2 reforms that were key ones. We have the pension reform, the one that I am very critical about, but there was also the labor reform, and I am a bit more optimistic about this one. Why? Because this reform will tackle precariousness and temporality of labor in Spain. Sorry, I am not very coordinating myself, so this is rather complicated. This reform ended the debate of many points that were not productive. And with this reform, we have created new tasks to have a more stable labor market with better conditions as well. Let's look at the labor market of Spain. Well, our labor market is the champion of temporality. We have double of temporality than any other countries. Let's check education, sectors, gender, whatever you look or you analyze it from, you will see that we have the double. And why is it? Because of the norms. Our legal framework has a dual character. We protect indefinite contracts and we do not protect temporal contracts, which means that 1/3 of the employment in Spain until 2008, most of the employment was temporal, of course. And who used to work with these CDDs or these temporal contracts? Young people, of course. Young people had to suffer this chaotic situation of having one contract after another, or maybe not more contracts. Until 2008, people who entered the labor market in Spain had to spend 5 years until they would receive an indefinite contract. We have experienced many reforms, but none of them tackled the main issue, meaning the difference between indefinite contracts and temporal contracts. Companies would renovate people once they had to, by law, give you an indefinite contract, meaning companies did not respect norms and sanctions were not very strict. With this reform, we want to make the norm indefinite contracts, meaning good contracts. But as we know, they have a very risky new component, these seasonal contracts. Why? Because the government wants indefinite contracts, but the framework of protection of these indefinite contracts is so strict that we cannot transfer all temporal contracts into indefinite contracts. So they have added this flexibility component, the seasonal contracts. This reform has reduced temporality, of course, because we have seasonal contracts. But now the question is, are jobs more stable now? Until now, we can worry. We can worry right now with the numbers that we have. And here we can see some figures. On the left, you can see the different reforms and how reforms would give us a reduction on the temporality. In 2022, we see a huge decrease, something that is rather surprising. Why? Because these temporal contracts have been transformed right now. We can also see that the temporality rate has decreased, of course. Right now, we are almost abiding to the European average. And this looks too good to be true, right? How can we arrive so quickly to the European average? I'm going to tell you why now.
Os he dicho que
I have mentioned that we have this permanent seasonal contract, and this contract is indefinite, which means that there isn't any clear termination date, but it has a singular characteristic and means that if the company does not need you, then you will go home. And of course, this offers more protection to the worker, because when the company needs you again, you will be integrated again in the company. But the worker can be sent home anytime, and we have the right to benefits, but the benefits are going to be lower, so there is a high uncertainty in the level of income you perceive. And the reform is astounding because no rules are imposed. We have a provision about the activity period, but there is not any day of work which is clear, and we have a limit for the inactivity period. So what I can see between the lines is that we want to transform these outsiders, these workers under a permanent seasonal contract, into an insider. And since the reform cannot tackle this problem in its entirety, it has created a situation in between. So the reform is less ambition than a reform that Eva may know, which means the single contract. I was one of the promoters of this kind of contract back in my youthhood, and this was a dramatic reform by which all seasonal contracts would be eliminated, and instead many indefinite contracts will be created. But we are talking about a plain indefinite contract where there isn't any uncertainty, like the permanent seasonal contract. And what happens that earlier we had workers signing temporary contracts, and now there is a high turnover under this permanent seasonal contract. So the company can call you and send you home many times, and so precariousness is also a reality, and also labor poverty is very common nowadays. And the problem of temporary contracts was that the companies were generating costs for themselves and also for those people unemployed, those people who had lost their jobs. But now, having this kind of permanent seasonal contracts are at no cost for the companies. So now we have this high turnover and we have created a perverse incentive. And why? Because companies are going to pay the contributions for those companies with a high turnover. And I would say that the data should invite us as a society to reflect upon. So you can see this data. On the left hand side, we can see the quarterly transition rate from the time a worker is working to the time he's under the so-called inactivity period or unemployed. And then we can see a red line that describes the permanent seasonal contracts. This line is above the transition from the employment to inactivity than to the employment to the temporary contracts, as it was the case earlier. Of course, we can witness a substantial peak in 2020 and due to the pandemic. So these transition rates are enormous. They are 20%. So a worker under a permanent seasonal contract can be working today, but not next quarter. And if we go to the right hand side, we have an upward trend, a red line which describes the contract that has been signed since the implementation of the new law. Those lines we can see here, las líneas discontinuas, are describing the time of contracts we have. They describe it perfectly well. And so these lines describe the number of people that were working temporarily prior to the reform. So what can we see? The red line shows that we have 250,000 more people who on average are working under a permanent seasonal contract, which in turn means that there is a high turnover in activity. So those workers who are under a permanent seasonal contract may quit their jobs more frequently. And do you know who they are? Well, you know that the government has said first elections and then we will see what happens with this reform. And from my side, I organized a meeting in Fedea, which was called the 2020 reform in Europe. And I'm not sure that this reform may be an example for other countries, because this interrupted way of working is troublesome, and the 0-hour contract in Europe is the rule across Europe right now. So this permanent seasonal contract can become a 0-hour contract. So we have to be more ambitious when fostering the continuity of work. And should we tackle many changes? Of course, but there isn't any problem about it, because I can tell a youngsters that I'm going to sign a seasonal contract with him, and I tell him that he has the whole labor, his or her whole career to become an indefinite worker, then I'm persuading him or her. But we want to describe under which contingencies we can sign a contract or another. So we have to tackle many changes. We have to start by making paid those who pollute more for what they pollute. And after the reform, Spain is ranking first the list of European countries with a more strict regulation on the, dismissals. So we have a high rate of unemployment. And what should be worried about? Well, we know that after a worker signs an indefinite contract, they will not sign another temporary contract because of certainty. And what could we do? Well, we could create an individual fund, an individual reserve fund, and then if we want to quit the company to become the worker of another company, well, we transfer this fund. So after a mandate that, in my opinion, has been focused on restored their rights, in the future, we should focus on those measures that will help us to converge with Europe in terms of employment. And then we have to foster productivity because we are blocked. We have been stagnated for many years now. And you can see, if you look at the productivity, that it's the case. Well, when it comes to multitasking, this is a problem for men. This is still a problem. You can see here the total productivity of factors. From 2000 in Spain, we are about 100. So we are talking about historical rates when it comes to unemployment. But let's not forget that we are 5 points under the European average. Just imagine that those people who are unemployed right now could work. So we could create so much richness across Europe. And concerning priorities, we should shorten the unemployment period and improve the employability for the unemployed people. Well, I'm not going to dive into it. Secondly, the permanent education is going to be key to improve the resilience and productivity of our market. But now authorities are who rule about education, and then we have to pay for it. And I think that every worker should pay for his or her education, and that could be saved and then be allocated to train each of us. And then we have a particular problem in Spain, which is the school dropout. If we want to improve the working conditions in Spain, we have to improve the link between education and labor market in the country. And we want to bet on the permanent education and training. And in Madrid, if we decide to study EVT, we can improve our possibilities of being hired ostensibly. So, I'm sorry because I was looking at my slide. So, many of the jobs of the future haven't been created yet. And the line between being an entrepreneur or being employed by a third party is becoming blurred. So in Spain, we have always set obstacles. There have been many hindrances on the approach we have regarding technologies or teleworking. So we needed to combine flexibility and productivity in our laws. And we have to foster the convergence among types of jobs. If it were the case, we should not regulate so precisely who would do what. And in my opinion, we need to protect people and not their jobs. In such a volatile world, we need to give people many opportunities to protect and defend themselves. And so I will leave it by now. And if you have any questions, you can reach me under these contact details. Thank you very much, Marcel. It was very interesting. And now we have Ulrich with us, and he's going to explain us how Austria is doing with the labor market, which is more flexible.
Vienna. Ulrich also worked at the Austrian Federal Ministry of Finance in the Economic Policy Department. And Brussels is a city he knows well because he's the former chairman of the high-level working group on competitiveness and growth in the Council of the European Union. So Ulrich, du bist jetzt dran. Ich gebe dir.
Thank you very much. Good evening from my side. I want to start with good news. So you have learned from Markus Knell that your life expectancy is rising quite fast. And if you look at the figures he presented, you will learn that your life expectancy increases in 1 day by 4.5 hours. So if you come to the conclusion after my presentation that it was nonsense and absolutely useless, there are still 4 hours of lifetime you gained today. So take this into account. And what I also would like to say in my brief presentation is I have simply one advice and 3 lessons I want to share with you, if I find them. So I think my advice is take always a step back and think about what you are doing and why you are doing things. Because what I observe very often is that we do things today because we did them yesterday, but we do not consider whether it's still necessary to do them today, even if they made sense yesterday. And the second thing is, what I also observe is we reform programs, but we do not reflect whether we still need the programs. And that's exactly what I will be talking about today, about the severance pay schemes in the European Union as an introduction, and then briefly to describe the Austrian reform. But I think the very important lesson we can learn from looking on the history is that the severance pay system has a background. It was invented by private enterprises in order to give, in the 19th century, some sort of a first unemployment insurance to the employees and also a first step to a pension system. And over time, the whole social security system in Europe has developed very well. And we have now an unemployment insurance system in every country. We have a pension system in every country. And we also have severance pay systems in every country, although it's hardly to argue why we need them anymore. But they are still in existence. So you see that there is a high persistence of programs, and it seems to be very difficult to abandon certain things. And also to make a link to the previous panel, I think the pension system is also a very good example, because when it was introduced in Austria in the year 1907, the retirement age for males and females in Austria was 65 years. And the life expectancy of the average Austrian male or female was 63 years. So the average pensioner was dead. But now, today, we have the same retirement age. For women, even lower, 60 in Austria. We have the same retirement age. This is also an example that a social system has stayed the same, but the circumstances have changed fundamentally, and it's not the same as it was in the past. It was in the past, it was an insurance for longevity of the people. Now it's a basic income scheme for middle-aged people. That's the fact, and I think this is something to take into account when making these discussions. But what I wanted also to share with you is that I think that especially Austria is a good example in which direction Spain could move, because Austria is completely different in the sense that it's an extremely flexible labor market. So if you want to dismiss somebody in Austria, there is no problem. So there are notice periods to be respected, but you do not need to have any reason. So it's absolutely easy for each enterprise to dismiss their employees. This is certainly not the good news, but the good news are that they are also not reluctant at all to hire new people. So we have a very large inflow and outflow in the labor market, and what you see in this graph is cohorts which started in 1 year, and then you see how many of them stayed in the same job after some month of time. And you see here for these different cohorts that only 20 to 25% of those who started the job in the year 2001 or 2 or 3 or 4 are still in the same job in Austria 60 months later. That's 5 years. So that's a very low number, and you have to take into account that here are excluded people employed in tourism, and there are excluded also the persons in the construction sector. So you see this enormous turnover we have in the Austrian labor market, because we have, contrary to Spain, nearly no employment protection. But it's a success story. But if you look on the unemployment rates in Austria compared to Spain, we have 5.1% last month, Spain at 12.1%, and a very impressive number. Also a link to the previous discussion on the pension system, the migration topic. Austria had an enormous inflow of labor in the last 5 years. 300,000 foreign workers came to Austria. That's 7.5% of total employment in Austria today. And now, the €1 question to you. I have an euro saved, and the question is, what do you think, from which country do most of the labor migrants to Austria come from? So I have €1 to spend to a lucky winner. Who tries?
Venga, ¿quién se atreve?
Who does to reply to the question? Where does the workers mainly come from? Yes?
Good, but close, but not true.
Okay, another try.
No.
El micro.
Sorry,
Italy?
Italia?
but it's a neighboring country.
Es un
It's a neighboring country to Austria.
destino de Austria, ¿eh?
It's a neighboring country. We are talking about Austria. Slovakia?
The correct answer?
Último, bueno, intentamos.
Well, last chance.
So it's Germany, and who would think of Germany? Germany, the country which has now the lowest unemployment rate, which has a quite dynamic economic development, but still the largest group of immigrants to Austria are Germans from the new Bundesländer, and they are coming to Austria because they find a job very easily in Austria. It's so easy to enter the labor market, and although there is nearly no employment protection, nobody is afraid of losing his or her job. And I think this is something which could form, I think it's a huge difference, but the direction I think should be one that could be also taken by the Spanish government in the future. So, to explain to you the severance pay reform in Austria, we had a system which was very similar to the Spanish one you have now. There was an entitlement after 3 years of tenures, and there was a stepwise increase in claims over time. The reserves had to be built up by the enterprises, but it was a system which was regarded as being unfair because only 1/3 of all employees received benefits, and also there was a critique that it should impede labor mobility. So also at that time when the reform was introduced in 2003, Austria wanted to increase even more labor mobility in order to increase also productivity, because the idea is that if people move to a better job, they are also more productive. And therefore, there was a reform introduced, which is a defined contribution scheme, so that employers pay 1.5307% of the wage sum. I don't know why they came on this number, but that's Austrian social partnership. So 1.5307 of the wage sum to private severance pay funds. So now everybody is entitled to benefits, and after 3 years of employment, the funds can be withdrawn in case of moving to another job. And the idea also was that this reform should not only increase efficiency at the labor market, but also to increase the incentives to use savings for old age benefits. So there have been also a sequence of pension reforms in Austria, and this severance pay reform was some sort of an additional element to the pension system. I show you this picture because it's the nicest one I ever constructed myself. It shows you the old system, so you see the increase over time of the entitlement in the old system, that's the red line, and the blue dashed line shows you the increase in the funds over time in the new system. And here you see how the systems also had incentives for the workers. You see here the severance pay claims for the old system, the red line, compared to the cumulative wage income. So you see that at the beginning there were really quite substantial claims from the old system, which then declined over time because, of course, the wage income accumulated to much larger numbers than the claims from the severance pay scheme, whereas the new system is a more stable development over time. You see that in Austria the system has been well accepted. Meanwhile, most of the employees are already in the system. But you also see that those who can take out the money of the system, they also do so. So there is certainly a construction failure in the whole system because it's not very attractive to save money in this publicly organized fund. And especially the incentives are bad because also the insurance companies have to always be prepared to pay out the money, so they cannot invest in long-term assets. And that's why the system as such has not contributed to the intended goal of being an additional pillar to the pension system. But now, the thing finally I wanted to present to you is that when we undertook the investigation of the Austrian severance pay reform, we were absolutely sure that there should be a large efficiency effects of the system, because there are these distortions of the payments, and that employees should be trapped in their jobs. But to our surprise, this was not really the case. So there is an impact of the severance pay system on labor mobility. You see here it's an increase in the probability of a termination of a job after 4 years. But it's not, by far, not as large as we expected. So this would be the third lesson for you, is that there is something like common wisdom, common beliefs, but never trust in that, because we were absolutely sure that we just had to prove what everybody knew, but in the end we couldn't prove what everybody thought to know, because it was not true. So coming back to my advice and my lessons, you see the Austrian reform is highly accepted. I think it's also famous internationally, and I've seen and learned that also Spain is looking at the Austrian reform. But still, I would like to remind you that the question is whether you need to introduce or reform a system, whether you need it at all. Because if we look at the Austrian system, it's certainly something where one also could reflect about whether it's still needed today. But the reform has moved the old system to a much better one. So you see that we have increased fairness, higher labor mobility, and also the liquidity of firms is not a problem as in the past. But also some of the things did not turn out as expected. I've mentioned the idea of the support for the pension system. So also here one needs to take care exactly what one wants to achieve, and then to take the right decisions. I think what I learned from the Spanish experience, that's exactly the same issue in Spain. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. It was extremely interesting, and also some of the conclusions that we thought would be. I found something interesting actually that you had in one of your last graphs, is that maybe something that we knew already, that women are less prone to labor mobility than men. This is also something maybe to have in mind. But now we have some time for a Q&A session, así que cualquier pregunta, ahora es el momento, y €1.
If you have any questions, please go ahead. And Ulrich, you owe our colleague €1. Don't forget it. Hi, hello. I am Brigitte Cuenca. I would like to take this opportunity to thank those who have brought us here, and I wanted to ask the following question. What perspectives or what probability is there in Spain to adapt or adopt a reform similar to the Austrian one? To be able to adopt this reform, we would have to reform the whole system, basically. All right, another question. I am Nicolás Dabrio. I wanted to ask the following question. Is high turnover costly for the companies? Because some workers will take a bit of time until they are completely productive and effective in their workplace, right? That is why we look for long-term careers. Doesn't it go against the Austrian system? Next question, please. I am Maria. Thank you very much for bringing us here. I wanted to ask the following question regarding training. Someone mentioned that there's a lack of education, and all of us here have a university degree, but we have a problem in Spain. Most of the young people in Spain are occupying posts for those, and we are overqualified for these posts. So how can we reflect this in an eventual labor market reform? Is it just a market issue? Oh, right, great, perfect. Another question over here. Last question for now. Hi, I'm Jose. Thank you very much for the speakers. What characteristics should new contracts have? We already mentioned flexibility. In the future, for those of us who are entering the labor market, what should contracts have? A better work-life balance, a reduced working time, for example, 6-hour working hours. All right, let's start over here. Marcel, you can start with the question about the Austrian reforms. Do you have translation? Can you hear me? All right, then I'm going to answer in Spanish. This reform has been contemplated in Spain since 2010. We don't want to adopt the whole Austrian reform. We were not going to adapt this severance pay. We would give the worker 8 days per year, and we would reduce the severance pay. And Minister Calviño had a very charged reform agenda where she mentioned this Austrian backpack. I am an external consultant for her, and we wanted to analyze what it would mean to adapt this Austrian backpack. And then the second part would be, how would the labor market change in behavior? And I wanted to mention something regarding what Ulrich said. Transition in Austria isn't very visible, but co-agents and co-authors see this perfectly. Those companies who are not going well tend to see their workers leave earlier. We had to publish a report, but because Podemos, the political party from Spain, asked us, we had to put this reform aside. We had to forget this reform. There's no political will when it comes to moving forward for this Austrian backpack. Why? Because companies think that costs will be higher. They think that we will see a bigger difference for those who are never fired and those who are constantly fired. Podemos thinks that this will create a bigger gap in the labor market. All of this could be corrected. This isn't the main problem, but the debate has ended, and that is why I highlighted this individual account. Individual accounts make more sense because this will bring education to people. People will be able to continue training whenever they want. Why don't we take half of this money and why don't we give it to the workers, to their individual accounts? Okay, you continue working. Do you want an English course? You go and follow an English course. Do you want to follow a programming course? You go and do it with the money that we already gave you. In my opinion, we have to change the perspective of the debate. The Austrian backpack is a reform for severance pay. But we should shift the debate and focus on these individuals' accounts. Training is very important. We wouldn't increase the cost. We would give more power to the workers. And in my opinion, this is a very good idea, of course. I don't know if Ulrich wants to say anything else. Ulrich.
A very good question before about the you know, this criticism that maybe, you know, all the knowledge or expertise would be would get lost if we have this kind of high labor mobility.
Exactly. So thank you. An excellent question. And I think also this idea of this saving accounts for training, I think is an excellent one, because we are in a completely different world today than we have been in the past. The first and most important thing at the labor market for success and productivity is to get in, to enter into the labor market. And here Austria has also advantage because we have a well-functioning dual education system. So the young people enter the labor market at the age of 15 and they learn, but also they learn on the job. And that's very important. And in a rigid labor market, it's very difficult to get in for the first time. Especially the young suffer from rigid labor markets, and that's not a good thing. And as we have changing labor markets, much of the learning takes place nowadays in the enterprises themselves, or the enterprises have to invest into education, or the employees have to invest into their own education. And that's why the most important thing is to get people into jobs, and of course to create incentives for further training for lifelong learning, which becomes more and more important because of our demographic structure. And also to make advertisement for the Austrian labor market, because maybe you consider to come to Austria. We also have, I think, a very flexible working time regulation. So you can choose your working time as you like. From 40 hours to 5 hours, you can choose everything. And meanwhile, we have the second highest temporary jobs ratio after Netherlands. But it's something which is to the benefit of the employees, because you always have to have this work-life balance and you have to arrange it. And that's also something where flexibility helps rather than strictly regulate working time. The normal working hours, they are just for orientation, to say, okay, when we have wage negotiations, what is the thing we are talking about? But to choose more or less hours, I think that makes sense in a working life we are living today. And therefore, I think also here, Austria has already very good regulations in place to deal with this challenge. And of course, one argument I understand fully is that you have learned a lot, and then you get into a job and you think, I'm hopefully overqualified. So that's also a challenge, especially for the young. But you will see, according to my experience, there is fast development of the challenges in their working life.
But in terms of expertise, Ulrich, so how would you say this? Is it more costly for the firms, or it's not seen like this in Austria in terms of that this labor mobility actually it's beneficial for the expertise? And
there are two competing hypotheses concerning productivity and labor mobility. The one that Austria is following is that if people choose to change, then they choose to change because they have a better opportunity in the new job. And if they choose to stay, they can stay. But if you prevent them from moving, then you will probably end up in a worse situation. And this does not imply in Austria that everybody leaves the job every year. Of course, there are also long tenures. But we have, of course, a technological development which implies a very frequent job changes and makes them also reasonable. And if a firm invests in employees, it will also try to keep them. And if individuals choose to move, they will have also a good reason to do so. So I think also here more freedom is in my point of view, the better way, rather than trying to find regulations in order to keep people or even keep them some sort in prison in their job. That shouldn't be the case.
Una visión muy liberal, así nos gusta aquí.
A rather liberal vision. Thank you very much. This is how we like it. Marcel, do you want to say anything about lifelong learning and qualification? I wanted to add a comment before this regarding Austria and Denmark. Florentino Felgroso and I, we analyzed the security labor perception in Europe. Denmark and Austria would be the highest ones in the list, and they don't have any unemployment protection. And in Spain, we have an average insecurity feeling that is similar to United States. United States is the less stable market in the world. You also asked me something about education. I wanted to recognize that Spain is the country with a higher percentage of young people who have finished their degrees and who are overqualified in their jobs. Or, something that is worse, that they are working in something that is not related with what they studied. This is related to the peculiar way of disseminating degrees in Spain. In Spain, we have this sand clock. We have a very broad basis of young people who have dropped out of school after secondary education, and then we have a lot of people who are on the top of this sun clock, who are following university degrees. In the middle, we lack people with VET, with vocational training. What does this mean? We have brought to the market more university graduates that we can bear, that we can receive. So these people who have the university degree are working in different jobs that in other countries are occupied by people who have followed a vocational training. The cognitive level, the knowledge, the experience of Spain is rather low when we compare it to the rest of Europe, and sometimes it is inferior to the level that we can get from a VET in Germany. We are calling graduates to people who have a very small percentage of knowledge. Spain is trying to correct this VET or the lacking of VET in situation. This dual vocational training has been present in Spain for 10 years, and right now I am assessing the impact on the country. We are trying to calculate what would happen if I took a young lady, a young man that is not going to go and follow a VET training in a room. Classic VET, 100% of the time is theory. And what would happen if I took this person and brought it to the company to learn on the company? We have seen a big increase of labor access in Madrid and Catalonia. The vocational training has more access to the labor market than university degrees. We of course need more students that follow VETs, but we also need to improve orientation so students can choose things that companies need. In Madrid, the most requested post is personal trainer at a gym. Can you imagine? And I've always said to my students, instead of going to the gym all the time, just go to the library, which is the gym for the mind. The reform that we need now is the university reform. Why? We need a better alignment of our diplomas. Companies must come closer to the diplomas. We could even think about these dual degrees, dual masters, where we combine theory at university and internships or apprenticeships in companies. I followed a degree in the 80s, and the way they tell me I have to teach my students is old-fashioned. And honestly, I have never followed these big renowned classes, and I survived more or less. So as I said, we need reforms in Spain for the university and for the education.
Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. Well, we don't have any more time. It has been very interesting. I know that there are a lot of questions that we cannot answer right now, but we have to leave it at this. Thank you for all your ideas, Marcel, Ulrich. We could think about a million of reforms. In Spain, we have looked at all the countries of the European Union, and right now I think that we have to stop looking and we have to act. But to be able to act, we need political will. We stop it here. We will see you tomorrow, and I hope that you are very fresh tomorrow. Please go to bed early. I know that today is Thursday and Brussels is the party city on Thursdays, but tomorrow we will have a very interesting session. You will be divided in the 7 groups of the European Parliament, and you will have to bring a resolution on European budget. This is very interesting, so I hope to see you all tomorrow morning, very early, but all very fresh, please.